Well, I was wrong. They say confession is good for the soul, and I must say that never in a million years did I envision myself speaking to you in front of a computer. Not even in 10,000 years could I have guessed this. When your pastor reached out to me, he had a confession of his own. He recently shared a story about me and my father, and he apologized for not mentioning much about my own experience. And well, long story short, enough time has passed that I'm able to speak about my trauma. And so here we are, a Jewish man speaking to a bunch of Christians about scriptures from your gospel reading at the invitation of one of your pastors. And I understand you have a long tradition of freedom of the pulpit and freedom of the pew, that is, where the preacher has the freedom to preach whatever she or he feels compelled to share, and you have freedom in how you respond. And from my vantage point, this is excellent because, and not just in a self-serving way, but because this dynamic offers all of you the ongoing choice to be humble or prideful. And that's what I want to touch on this morning. In the very first words of our reading this morning, Jesus the teacher, a Jewish man I might add, asks, "But to what will I compare this generation?" He says his generation is like children playing instruments for people in the streets and no one dances. That it's like kids crying and nobody cares. His words are piercing, and they make pretty clear to me that his generation was not listening. They weren't hearing. Paraphrasing something else I've heard attributed to Jesus, all those with ears, may they hear. I gather he had to say that often. Jesus, the teacher, goes on to say that this must mean that God has hidden the truth from the wise and learned, choosing instead to reveal the truth to children and infants, that it was God's will to do it this way. Now, I can't speak to all that was going on in Jesus, the teacher's day, so many hundreds of years after my own generation, but when he describes his generation and to whom he can compare them, well, I can think of one. I think back to the story you heard a version of last week, and I find that while his words aren't necessarily comforting to me now as an aged man, I can relate to his words when I think back to that moment as a child when I know God was revealing truth to me and my father wouldn't hear it. To refresh your memory, I'll remind you very briefly of this story. And I know all of you are devout in your faith, and each of you attend worship services every single week. I'm sure you've all heard the sermon from last week already, and you remember this story well. But just in case some plague struck your land and you were unable to join, the story goes like this. My father, Abraham, living in a time period when other religions weren't shy about this sort of thing, he believed he heard a word from God that he must sacrifice me. On a mountain, me, the son my father was not shy about reminding me was the long-awaited and promised blessing, me. Now he's supposed to murder me. Piously? What kind of God would do that? What kind of man? My father didn't tell me that part of the story. He only told me we were going to make a sacrifice. He brought servants. We packed up wood, no animals, and we journeyed for days. I asked questions. I felt safe with my father. But the further we went, the less I felt so. And, well, I won't retell the whole trauma, as others might be triggered by more details, but suffice it to say that I tried to understand what was happening. I inquired and interrogated my father, and he kept saying, God will provide. Little did I know that in his mind he believed God already had provided the day I was born. To what generation would Jesus compare his own generation, who didn't hear or respond to the questions and cries of children? I'd say my father's. My father was mistaken, and he couldn't admit it. He couldn't even see it. He was so dead set on his own version of facts. He so believed in his manifest destiny of progeny and a legacy and a land that he ceased being curious about new information, pre-existing information, other people's opinions and perspectives and experiences, even his own son's. He ripped our family apart when he ripped those logs out of my hand and made them into an altar for me to climb onto. To what generation would Jesus compare his own generation who were complicit in injustice and harm? My father's. His servants didn't speak up. They didn't intervene. Not one of them spoke a word in my defense. They didn't want to upset him, so they stood silently with the mules while I carried my own funeral wood. They tried to hold me as I wept on the way back down the mountain, giving lip service to God for the ram in the bushes and whispering sweet bull stuff in my ears. My father might have birthed a nation, but he was not perfect. Just ask my brother Ishmael and his mother Hagar, both of whom my father banished to the wilderness. I won't give him the power to think he banished me. I left, I ran away, and I found my brother bearing the same burden. My father was not perfect. He committed other heinous offenses I won't recount here for the same reasons as I stated earlier, so that I don't re-traumatize anyone else. But here's the thing. One of the gravest mistakes he made was not recognizing or admitting either one when he was wrong. Now, I'm no preacher or psychologist, only a descendant and a co-founder of a faith tradition that is robust to this day, but I see the harm that pride causes, the damaging patterns that a lack of curiosity and humility enables, the burden of perfection that myths demand of their adherents. To what generation would Jesus the teacher compare his own generation who wouldn't listen and admit that they were wrong about him or the prophet John? Might it be yours? I'm no Christian or American, but as I learn about your history and your state of affairs today, I think he could be speaking about you. None of you, of course, but this generation, we'll say. How many kids are wailing in schools after acts of violence? Have you changed any laws to make them safer and join in their mourning? Have your prayers and protests paved the way for new policies? How many people of color are mistreated, silenced, and sacrificed to keep the system running smoothly? Who are the powerful people trying to protect? How many people gloss over the imperfections of history like they're buffing the idols of myths and men? Why is it so important to say that your nation was founded on Judeo-Christian values? I'm quick to say that my father was wrong to try and kill in God's name. That's not the God I represent. If your nation was founded with legalized slavery, is that a Christian value? Is systemic racism? What about preferencing being white as the norm, or reinforcing superiority and supremacy of whiteness by your laws and policies? Is that what this country is about? Is that what your faith is about? I know your pastors and many other Baptists would say that the nation wasn't founded on Judeo-Christian values anyway, that it's about freedom. And that brings me back to my initial thought, how excellent freedom is, because it offers you the ongoing choice between humility and pride. Jesus, the teacher, ends this reading with another quote I can relate to. He says, to those who are feeling burdened by literal, systemic, or metaphorical funeral pyres, to to take his yoke instead. And while I can't offer any insight in terms of a Christian understanding of this text, I can say that from my experience, all I wanted on that walk up the mountain was for someone, anyone, to step in and take that burden off my shoulders. For someone, anyone, to even share in the burden I was carrying. For someone, anyone to intervene in the name of what was right and good and just and loving. And in the end, God did, with a ram and an angel with a loud shouting voice. But not everyone is so lucky. I understand your theme this summer is, who do we choose to be? So I ask you, what about your generation? What about your faith community? Will you be like my father's generation? Like Jesus the teacher's generation? Will you remain silent while injustice presses down on the chests and backs and necks of the oppressed? Or will you use your proximity to power to speak up, to speak out, to admit you were wrong? The burden of perfection is strong in your culture. Confession is a sign of weakness for so many. I wish my father had apologized to me and admitted he was wrong. Nothing could have made him look any stronger in my eyes, but he never did. And I could never trust him not to do it again, because he never recognized it was a problem, that he was wrong. The burden of perfection is like a locust's exoskeleton. It's protecting so much that is tender and raw on the inside, but too often it prohibits you from examining your own feelings and experiences too. Thank our God that we all have endoskeletons. Maybe more prone to being wounded, to making mistakes, but easier to be introspective, to confess and to forgive. I don't understand why people are so averse to being wrong. It's just a blemish. It heals, it scabs, it scars, and you move on, less likely to hurt yourself or someone else in the same way again. That seems like a really good thing to me. It seems to me, from this outsider's perspective, that one way you might think of Jesus the teacher's words is that you can't bear each other's burdens unless you're honest with one another. And that includes being honest with yourself, and being honest about the past, being honest about the incongruence in your actions and professed beliefs, being honest that the future might not look like you envision it. Myths impose a burden of perfection upon their adherents. Faith demands honesty. Honesty in doubt, in belief, in dreams, in disappointments, in rights and in wrongs. It's a yoke that Jesus the teacher says is light and humble. So, on a weekend when you're celebrating the unfinished work of liberation, of lightened burdens, remember that freedom is that ongoing choice between humility and pride, of having an endoskeleton or an exoskeleton, of serving others or serving only yourself. So who do you choose to be? Wrong?